Good evening, everybody. I said good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Arbour. If you haven't been here before, if you have been, welcome back. This evening's discussion is a panel discussion by the Centre for Disability and Research and Policy from the University of Sydney. Now, the CDRP, they work to improve social and economic participation, health, and well-being of people with disability. The topic of today's conversation is raising the disability flag in diversity. So, disability is not well represented in diversity conversations, but this panel is about to change all that. So please welcome Kim, Rodney, Jen, and Shane.
Thank you. Hello everyone, thank you for coming along. I know there's a lot of competition for things to be going to tonight, so thank you for those of you who've come along. My name's Kim Bulkley and I'm an Associate Professor at the University of Sydney in the Centre for Disability Research and Policy. And our work is really about working with and standing as strong allies with people with disability and including people with disability in our teams, in research, in academia, and in everything we do. So partnership with people with disability and leadership by people with disability is an important part of our work at the Centre for Disability Research and Policy. And that's what we want to talk about today and hopefully spark some conversations for you as well. Before I go on any further, I'd like to acknowledge the tradition of custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand, and also acknowledge the Jinnabara people who are the custodians of this land, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that we all learn well, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been teaching us about sharing knowledge for thousands and thousands of years. So we would be wise to pay attention to the way that they teach us to share knowledge. So I pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here tonight and extend that respect to elders past and present. So our conversation today is really asking us to imagine a world where people with disability are, and you can fill in that blank. We're going to give you some ideas from our work, but I really encourage you to be thinking about that and taking that idea with you when you leave here today. So if we plant that in your mind for now, when we have time at the end for questions, we'd really love to hear your ideas about that based on the insights and hopefully understandings that we bring to you tonight. So disability is not well represented in our communities and in all parts of our experience. And that's not just an issue for Australia, that's internationally. We know that there are real equity issues in many, many areas for people with disability. So I've worked as an occupational therapist and now an academic in the disability sector since the 1980s. So I worked with people, mostly with people with intellectual disability when I worked in the community. And things have come a long way since the 1980s. I kind of moved into this field when there was a bit of a revolution happening. Deinstitutionalisation was a really big movement. So people with disability had historically been placed in institutions where families and the person with a disability was advised that people in those places know how to look after you or know how to support you. And we now know that that was really not a very good thing at all. It was terrible. And so the change in government policy and the change in thinking around listening to people with disability, looking at how they could be supported to live their best lives in the way they wanted to, rather than being institutionalised, was a revolution. And as a new graduate occupational therapist at that time, I was like, wow, I need to be part of this. And so much has come a long way since then. Our National Disability Insurance Scheme is the envy of the world in many ways. It's not without its flaws. I'm not saying it's perfect, but the fact that our government has committed substantial funding and has been guided by people with disability in the design of the National Disability Insurance Scheme is a significant shift in public policy. So we are at a point in our experience of services and supports for people with disability that we can be proud of. But the report card is probably a could do better, right? There's still things that are not right, that haven't been put together well and thoughtfully enough, or that were put together well and thoughtfully and haven't been implemented in the right way. So the policy implementation has lacked. So you would have heard in the media lots of issues about the NDIS, and we need to address those, but we can't let that dominate the conversation and take over everything about how we value and regard and support people with a disability. So just to go through a few of the bad stories, because equity and inclusion for people with disabilities still remains a problem. So health issues for people with disability are really significant. Access to the health system as an institution does not serve people with disability in the same way that it supports the general population. For example, people with intellectual disability have double the rates of avoidable deaths in our health system than the general population. That's a shocking statistic. That's not acceptable by anyone's standards. And so we really need to be having a look at our health system, and people will talk a bit more about that individually as we go through the panel. Unemployment is significantly worse for people with disability, double the rates of unemployment for people with disability. Housing, access to the housing that people choose, to secure housing, to appropriate housing is a significant issue, as well as, I've just lost my train of thought, as well as increased risks of violence, abuse and neglect for people with disability. So there's quite a few of the health and wellbeing indicators that are a problem for people with disability that we are not doing well enough, and we believe that we could be doing better, but we need to understand what those issues are and look at how we can get equity for people with disability. So the report card, as I said, is could do better, and we want to grow that conversation with you tonight. So I'm going to start with Rodney, and each of the panel will introduce themselves as they start and join the conversation. So I've got Rodney here, who is going to talk, I'd like you to talk, Rodney, a bit about your background, but also about Auslan and the history of Auslan in Australia and Auslan in schools, and that impact in terms of inclusion and equity for people who are deaf.
So I'm a deaf Koori from Western New South Wales. I was born hearing and became deaf when I was 2 through meningitis. So I grew up in a mainstream school with teacher support for deaf children, and I did that right the way through high school. And I learnt Auslan later on in life when I was 18, because at the time that was normal for many deaf children to learn sign language later in life, until they finally got a language they could use to communicate. It was seen often, but it was important. I'm not sure if you've seen ABC Stories with the story called Sophie's Choice. And that talks about raising a child in a profoundly hearing environment. So it's a deaf child in a hearing environment with parents who've never taught about teaching sign language. And this young girl was deaf. Both parents were quite well-known dancers. They were involved in theatre and ballet, and the message from them and the message that they got from the professionals was to raise your daughter to hear and speak. And then when she discovered Auslan, she was pissed, really. She really felt that shame, and she rejected her father's teachings because she'd been denied all of that language until she was later on in life. And it talks about her mental health issues, it talks about trying to survive in the hearing world, and just realising that she wasn't actually part of it. And for many of us deaf people, we have similar experiences. So I have been working as a teacher of the deaf, and I've seen many deaf children, yes, with hearing aids and cochlears, but still struggling without proper access to any form of language. So now, with the introduction of Auslan in schools, and things are slowly improving, but we do have big gaps to fill. And I'm sure most of you are all aware of the gaps, but there are huge issues with teaching deaf and hard of hearing children due to language deprivation, which is extreme because we can't access language early. The early intervention is more beneficial. Earlier the better for language gaps. And these gaps arrive because we don't get incidental hearing of language. So the education is very mono, very, very singular focused on speech therapy, audio therapy, listening, but relying on that. Yes, it's important, but relying on that system to help deaf and hard of hearing children succeed will ultimately lead to failure. And I think we've seen that multiple times over and over and over. So I'm grateful to have found Auslan when I was 18. And looking back, I wish that I had learnt Auslan earlier in life when I was very, very small, so that I had that language growing up, because it's also linked to identity. And it's important to develop that for all people and for all disabled children especially, learning to accept who they are. And yesterday, we talked about attitude. Attitude is really profound in the impact that it has, and we need to make sure that deaf and disabled children are growing up comfortable with their identity, not just to help them succeed or help them survive, but to really excel, to thrive. That should be our aim, thinking about how to provide a better quality of service to match the individual need of the human rather than a one-size-fits-all blanket.
Thank you, Rodney. That's really helpful. One other question I have for you is, you've been teaching me a lot about the deaf community in the past few years, because you've been teaching our students at the University of Sydney. And one of the things that you brought to my attention, and maybe you can update us, is that Auslan is not a language on the curriculum when we have all these other languages that is available for students to learn in high school. Is that still the case?
Auslan itself is a community recognised language, which means there is no legislation ratifying Auslan as a language. Other countries do have their signed languages ratified. Australia hasn't yet done that in the legislative language process to acknowledge Auslan formally, which brings up many different issues of its own. And if we had more validation of Auslan, we could slowly change. We could see more of a trickle out into the curriculum. And I know that one reason why the Victorian government specifically funds significant funds into Auslan and the anthropology of language is because people who do learn 2 or 3 languages from birth develop significantly more intellectual levels. So we think about back in the past, Australia, whether you use the modern sign or the Indigenous sign, Australia was often a country with 2 or 3 language groups, and they were fluent in each of the languages of their region. So Indigenous Australians were a multilingual nationality, and that then changed. And now I hope that they're going back to realising the value of language and how important that is for deaf children. So yes, in the future, and that's a question mark, there should be a rollout, especially in New South Wales. I think in the next 2 years, there'll be a rollout in the national curriculum, having Auslan placed in the language curriculum. So it's not just focusing on Auslan. I want to stress that. It's focusing on Indigenous sign languages as well, because there are many of those in the country around Indigenous nations, Torres Strait nations. Like I've said before, these children struggle. There's about 32% of Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander children have hearing impairments and hearing losses, which really isn't medically accessible. But the figures are high, and we need to try to prevent LDS, and we need so that's language deprivation for those populations. We need to focus on hearing aids and cochlears in a way, because they help some, but they are not the only solution, and they are not the only language inclusion. We need to include languages like Auslan and signed Indigenous languages as well.
Thanks, Rodney. I'm going to go across to Jen now. Jen has done some work together. Jen and I have done some work together on employment of people with disability. And there were some interesting things that we came across that are concerning, to say the least, but certainly need us to understand more about. So do you want to talk a bit about who you are, and then about your work on employment?
Well, I'll briefly talk about who I am, but then talk about that and then go back to who I am again. I'm the Director of the Centre for Disability Research and Policy, and in that position I have tried to put in place a lot of strategies that will support the employment of people with disability within universities through using diverse funding sources and trying to promote career development of people with disability. I don't have disability myself, but also have been really interested in this conundrum we have, where we have a big labour shortage in Australia around disability services. So we don't have enough people to provide disability services, partly because of the huge disability support market that has arisen around the NDIS. So we have a real need. And at the same time, we have really low levels of employment of people with disability. So I just became really annoyed by this, because there's obviously a correlation where you could be employing and training more people with disability to work in disability services. So Kim and I, we run a national survey for National Disability Services, which are the national peak body for disability, where we ask them about the way that they deliver services. So we put some questions in where we asked how many people with disability are employed within disability services, so which these services were answering the survey, and then how many people with disability were in leadership positions within these services. And what we found was that hardly any services had more than 5% of staff with disability. Most either didn't know if they had any people with disability working within their organisations, or had maybe one, or, you know, like very, very small numbers of people with disability working with those services. And I think the frustration there is that one of the things that we say about, well, one of the things that employers say is that they don't know, they couldn't employ people with disability because they wouldn't know what to do. But surely disability services should know what to do. They should be on the page. but they're not. And I think that just shows that there's actually an implicit ableism within disability services too, that they think people with disability are they're the subjects of their services. They're the objects of their support. They don't see them as part of a community. Like they're not, people with disability are not valued as part of this community. So just to go back to who I am for a minute. So as I said, I'm the director of the Centre for Disability Research and Policy, and I've been the director for 6 years, more than 6 years, since 2018. I was the second director without disability, and it's become an anachronism to have a disability centre led by someone that doesn't have disability. But universities do not make it easy to have a career that puts someone in the place where they can take on the leadership of a research centre. And that's because universities are not supportive places. They do not support people with disability, and that they should be. Like, universities are progressive organisations, but they don't, and they want to embrace diversity, but again, it's not a thought-out approach to diversity. So anyway, it's my last day as director today, and I'm really happy that Shane is the new director of the Centre for Disability Research and Policy, and it's very exciting, and I think it's a fantastic way to end the year. But also, it's fantastic to be talking today alongside Shane.
Thanks, Jen. So that piece of research really showed to us, in terms of employment, that there was, as Jen said, a sort of implicit ableism where the organisations didn't have people on their boards to guide them, to be saying, hang on a minute, where are our, this is a solution for some of our employment issues. Why are we not mobilising the expertise of people with disability who have a great contribution to make to our workforce? And so that leadership was a real issue. So Shane and I have had many conversations about this, but Shane is also looking at this as part of his research. So could you talk to us a bit more, Shane, about leadership, experience, lived expertise, etc.?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim and Jen. I'm dealing with, weirdly, imposter syndrome. Fortunately, the insecurity police have been around, and I probably should be giving them my sense of imposter syndrome to take on the Centre for Disability Research and Policy, because Jen has done an exceptional job in it. But the fundamental reason why it's important for me or someone like me with a disability to take on the leadership is because the foundational principle of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And people with disability have been leaders in the changes that Kim has talked about, alongside people without disability. So it's always been a partnership and should be a partnership. So I'm certainly not angry that the previous leader for the Centre for Disability Research and Policy was a non-disabled person, because we've needed their support to bring changes in universities which have, as Jen says, not made it easy for people with disability to take on leadership positions. So this foundational principle is really important, and it really stems not just from, well, I think, let me just step back and say, the first thing to say is, imagine a world where First Nations people were not in control of their own destiny, and that's been our society for, that's been true for 200 years now, and we don't put up with that anymore. But disability is still in that place where our destinies and our services are controlled by people without disability. So nothing about us without us is this important principle. But the question sort of in the back of your mind is, well, why do we need people with disability leading spaces? And that is because the experience of disability gives you an expertise that people without disability can never get because they don't live the experience themselves. And so there's this amazing untapped expertise amongst the diverse people of disability out there that is just waiting to be poured into our services, our employment, and all the spaces where people with disability live, work and play. When I think about, I guess, and I think it's always best to just sort of bring it back to our own stories. As I said yesterday, for those who were here, I had a spinal cord injury 14 years ago. And when I had that injury, I knew nothing about disability at all. We talked yesterday about ableism, and Rodney talked about attitudes now. So ableism is the word we apply to negative attitudes to disability. It has a common sense meaning, which is sort of parallel to sexism, racism, etc. It's got a sort of a deeper meaning, which is mostly people think they have positive attitudes to people with disability, but they tend to have negative assumptions about the capacity of people with disability, about what people with disability can and can't do. And so that feeds into the fact that we don't empower them to take leadership in their own lives and in the services of people with disability. And I've now lived with spinal cord injury for 14 years. It's a long time. I was saying to my brother, his children can't remember my life before this spinal cord injury. And when I first had this injury, I had internalised ableism. I knew nothing about disability. I had negative attitudes to my own disability. I was desperate to escape that disability. And yet I learnt so much through those 14 years. I experienced grief and loss and had to manage and work out how to live with sort of increased dependence upon others. I had to deal with the loss of the injury upon the impact upon my marriage. It affects the give and take in a marriage. It affects sexuality and intimacy. I had to learn to parent again. I incurred my spinal cord injury by playing with my children. There was a jump set up into a foam pit. People were jumping bikes and push bikes, so I was doing that with my children. And then suddenly I could no longer parent the same way, so I had to learn to reparent with my children. And it was really interesting because the way in which I did that was to get them to do my personal care. So all of a sudden, I was spending 2 hours in the morning and an hour at night with my children, and it's great for them because they're learning about bodies and they get a crash course in the human body in a way that they wouldn't have had before. And then over time, I learnt so much about living with a disability that doctors and medicos and others don't have. And what was really interesting in my spinal cord injury experience, there's no people on the ward employed with a spinal cord injury. Not a single one. The only people who have a spinal cord injury are funded by Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. They're outsiders, funded by charity who send people with lived experience onto the ward. They're called peer support workers. And as much as I love my physios, my doctors, my occupational therapies, they made a great difference in my life. The people that enabled me to see that I could make a go of life with disability was the peer support workers who've been living with this disability for, the same amount of time as I have now, who came in and showed me that, hey, we live a great life. We're out in the community, we're doing great jobs, we're living meaningful. Spinal cord injury isn't the end of life, but it's the beginning of a new life. And I learnt that from the expertise of people who had been living with this injury, and it made such a difference. And so over the course of the years, I've encountered so many people with disability, and I've learnt so much from them. One of my close friends is deaf, and I've got one of my closest friends is blind, Ron McCallum. I'm right now involved in a project which is putting people with intellectual disability onto the governance board of the Disability Trust, which is a major service provider in Australia. And again, there's prevailing assumption that people with intellectual disability aren't capable of making decisions for themselves, let alone making governance decisions for big organisations. And yet, who better to be able to input into the governance of a disability service provider than a person with intellectual disability who's experienced their services over the course of his life. So we're really excited to be one of the first to be doing a research project evaluating one of the first people with intellectual disability on a governance board of a major disability service provider. So there's so much more I could say about that, but yeah, this is all about recognising that lived experience of disability enables you over time to develop expertise. We become experts in our own body, in our own care. Now we need to collaborate with doctors and medicos and others to be able to bring out the best in us, but they need to listen to us as well. The professions raise up people with lots of power, with lots of kudos, with lots of education, and they tend to be proud and certain of their own knowledge, and there's a real need for humility in the professional, the medical professionals and others to say, hey, we don't know everything and we can learn from others whose voice hasn't been heard enough.
Thanks, Shane. That whole shift in power that Shane just alluded to is a key part of us trying to address the diversity or the inequities that people with disability experience. One of the things I just wanted to move on to, it's a little bit of an aside, is around representation and visibility of people with disability in roles where they are valued, are seen as really capable and competent. And one of the things we've been trying to do, and I've been part of this, is have more educators with disability employed at the university teaching our students. And I'm really, committed to that. And I'm just interested to hear from you, Rodney and Shane. You both do teaching into the units of study in the disability participation major that we run. What are your thoughts about being an educator of people with university students as a person with lived experience of disability? Do you want to take that one first, Rodney?
I think it's really, really important to have lived experience. And I know that when I was teaching at university, I was sharing my experiences with the different subjects that I was involved in at Sydney University. And I think the students were more engaged. They asked a lot more questions, certainly. They wanted to know a lot about my life, what it was like growing up, because they themselves would be going out into the world, into the workplace, needing to translate my experience into some sort of engagement with clients that they had. So that was really important for them. I was almost the missing link. I think it was yesterday that we talked about immersion and how powerful a word immersion actually is, because you need to live with people who have disabilities or who are deaf or who have extra needs just to see what it's like. And I know that recently the research into that field, which is in America, says that deaf professionals and colleagues are putting surveys out into the community, and they had 2,000 people responded. But the question was, do you think deaf and hearing people are equal? And the response was 87% no. Deaf and hearing people are not the same. And that was staggering to read that article. And I was wondering why and how we can change that. I think it's important to just keep that in mind and think about how we can improve the profile of people with disabilities. So as Shane has said, and he's now the director of the organisation, I work at Sydney University in a teaching capacity. We need more people in those roles. That's how we change the general attitude, because 87% of the community showing autism is terrible.
Absolutely.
So that's why I love going back into history and looking at the traditional Indigenous communities and just seeing the prolific use of signed languages that were there. And it wasn't even thought about differences or autism or how they were born. They were just in the community. That's just what they did in the community, regardless of whether they could hear or not. So there's a big difference between then and now. So inclusion and segregation are massively active now, and we need to work on bridging the two to resolve the issue so that the statistics out of that survey become less prolific.
Absolutely. So that whole thing of learning from Indigenous cultures how to address some of these issues, because they are great teachers for us, from those examples that you're giving us around autism, for example, and inclusion in Indigenous groups before colonisation. Thanks, Rodney. Shane, your thoughts about being an educator of university students and bringing a lived experience of disability to that?
Yeah, I'm old, so I've been teaching in higher education for 25 years now. So I'm 54 and I started teaching, I think, around 29. So, I was a good teacher before my spinal cord injury. I got relatively good student feedback, but I feel like what I knew there was more theoretical. And I feel like my teaching got so much more enriched after I had my disability. Originally, I was involved as an ethics and theology teacher. And ethics and theology, they're subjects that are all about life and its vulnerabilities and its complexities and its difficulties. And yet, probably before that lived experience, I was largely dealing with those topics in a theoretical way. And so to be able to bring your experience to the classroom, not in an egocentric way, look at me, but more in a, we're going through this journey together, because I was adjusting to spinal cord injury in those early days and dealing with grief and loss and could bring that to the classroom. And so it greatly, I feel like, enriched my teaching of ethics and theology. I worked at the Royal Commission for 4 years, so I didn't get to teach for a period, and then came to the University of Sydney, and Jen was teaching ethics and then got me back involved in an ethics subject, and it was so exciting to come and teach ethics at Sydney University again and to be able to bring this further experience, not only my own personal experience, but the experience of what I'd learned at the Royal Commission. And so your teaching is more concrete, more real, and I think as a consequence of that, it's more alive. And we haven't done a full evaluation of that. Kim and I are looking to get a study in place to sort of evaluate the students' experience of that. But we've been there a year now, and every semester the University of Sydney collects student survey information back from students, and it's in the comments section. It's just a repeated statement of how much they value and love lived experience, because it just makes it real and concrete to them. So I think it makes a real difference at university, and I think the challenge, and Rodney hinted about this as well, is that we've got this lived experience in some places. So it's in an occupational therapy program. It's in a little bit of health sciences, but not much. But I don't think it's very much in the medical systems. It's very rarely, unless it's incidental and it just happens to be there, it's probably not in law. Now, there was at the University of Sydney, there was a blind professor for many years who was in their law faculty, but he's now retired and isn't replaced. So I think our challenge at the university is to bring this rich disability experience across the university, because disability is everybody's business. It's not just about the health sciences, but there's people with disability, and disability is dealt with in every profession. So we need to drastically ramp it up, Kim, but I've loved the teaching, and I think the students are getting a lot out of it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So one of the things that, in terms of us having an equity conversation here, is that The statistics tell us that 20% of Australians have a disability. But when you look at representation in universities as students or as educators or in leadership roles in the university, we're not seeing 20%, right? It's just nowhere near that. So I guess one of my imagining a world where people with disability are 20% of students, 20% of educators, 20% of leaders at the university, 20% of our boards, 20% of our leadership in the health system. Like all of those places where we really need to be getting some equity around the presence, visibility and contribution of people with disability. And, just think of that 20% figure. That's not a small figure, right? That's one of the biggest, diversity groups that you might come across besides women and men, I guess, right? So I think we've really got a way to go with our performance in that area. So I want to open the floor to some questions, and then we'll come back and get a final thought from each of the panel about what world you imagine and what your thing would be. So if there are any questions from the floor or statements.
I go back to, I'll take these off. Okay, I go back to what you said about Auslan not being a ratified language, and that there must be a number of issues that are impacting on you, and I'd put this to Shane. How can you get politicians who are there just for a 3-year period and whose main concern is their own careers, well, they put that above any issue? So trying to ratify Auslan, that doesn't get me as much credit, so I'll go for something else that'll get me more credit. How do you get past that? Who is there down in Canberra that can really be a catalyst for change for you guys?
Do you want to answer that one, Jen, or?
I think he asked you, but
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. I'll let it go. But
I'll say something.
Yeah.
I think that I'm a policy researcher, so I look at what makes a difference in policy change. And actually, I think with disability and with, so I work mainly in severe mental illness, the thing that makes the difference with politicians is their own personal experience of disability, someone in their family, people that they encounter in their work. So I think it's the same thing that is people being in the community and in conversation with politicians who have disability is what really makes the difference, because that sways them to then use their term to act rather than just secure the next term.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, I'd only add that it's a long-term goal, and it's something. Despite the recent politicisation of the NDIS that we did talk about a bit yesterday, that I am optimistic about, because disability, everyone encounters it. So politicians can't escape it. But the disability movement is determined and strong, and they don't give up. They're loud. We haven't accomplished all we'd want to yet with politics. But you can be pretty certain that this loud, proud, disabled community doesn't give up the fight.
Rodney, do you have any thoughts about how we could get Auslan into the curriculum and get a higher profile?
I know that when I first started teaching, it was overwhelming in a lot of ways, because I was focusing on a system that was so focused on speech and speech therapy and voicing and hearing. A lot of things have changed since then, and I know that with the United Nations back in 2018, they first ratified the International Day of Sign Language. So every year on the 23rd of September is the International Day of Sign Language, and each different country in the world has its own signed language. But it's good to see that we're starting to see that trickle into politics. So something was done. I remember seeing some prime ministers from different countries making ballot presentations or some form of film in sign language to motivate voters to vote for them. But that still makes an impact. It's still showing sign language, and it's still showing that sign languages are okay, that we don't affect speech or hearing. We work congruently with them, and we can embrace sign language as a normal language, just like any other spoken language. So that type of validation by the UN really raises the percentage of the population who are actually aware of sign languages and recognise the acceptance of them. So now we are seeing universities offering Auslan, and the numbers are increasing. Schools themselves, state and public schools, are increasing their languages of LOTE to the point that they can't find enough Auslan teachers who are actually deaf to teach those languages. So in some ways it's a positive impact, but some ways there are other issues created by that. So we need to train the appropriate people. They should be deaf people who have the Auslan and English skills to be able to work in the institutions that are providing the education in Auslan. So there are positives, which obviously come with their own negatives in that field.
I remember when COVID was on and there was the daily premier's or whoever's message, and there were Auslan interpreters there, and it raised awareness of Auslan as a way of communicating with many more people. And I know just a small experience of mine, and many more of the occupational therapy students that I work with are now wanting to learn Auslan and are doing that than before, because it just gained a profile. So I think another aspect of getting political attention is profile, and raising the profile of the value of Auslan or sign languages more broadly as a really important contribution to our community, in a broader way. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Do I need to stand up? Hi, I'm Rosario from Argentina. I have a question. I wrote it down just to make sure that it makes sense in English or in Spanish in my brain. So, and I'm really sorry if you touched on this before. I just walked by and I thought this was an interesting conversation that you were having up there. But I would like to understand, what are your thoughts on companies, especially in the corporate world, having a disability diversity quota as part of their agenda, or part of like their annual KPIs and strategy? And I guess that the follow-up question is, where do we draw the line, like the ethical line, between what's the right thing to do and what is tax deductible driven? Thank you.
Do you want to talk about quotas, Jen?
So yeah, I know about quotas. So because when we were doing this research in Australia, we were looking at what does the government actually have at its disposal in order to force organisations to employ people with disability. So in some countries in the world, they use quotas. They use like a quota where it's like you've got to have 5%, I don't know, it depends what country it is, employees, or you've got to pay a tax penalty. And then that tax penalty goes into disability inclusion type strategies. And it's quite well used in a lot of European countries, in a lot of Asian countries. We don't have it in Australia. Australia's approaches are mainly about the goodwill of companies taking it on themselves. So that's a pretty weak lever. Like, it's a weak lever. In Australia, we tend to not impose taxation, those sort of taxation penalties. They do work, but they also can lead to sort of perverse incentives where they're employing people. So I think there was a scandal in Japan about 1.5 years ago where companies were reaching, like say an electronics company, I can't remember what actually it was reaching its disability quota by opening a fish farm and then employing all the people with disability in a fish farm. So they weren't creating jobs in the electronics industry, they were just maintaining sort of menial jobs. And that's then entrenching this idea that any job is good for a person with disability rather than a sort of a career. So they're good, but can be problematic as well.
Thank you. Another question? Oh, yep.
Hi, thanks very much for that. Look, I won't get too political, but I'm an educator. I've been in a classroom for 17 years, had the opportunity to teach students with disabilities for most of that. I'm also a very active member in the New South Wales Teachers Federation, which is the biggest union in Australia. I was just wondering, what is the capacity, unions being drivers of social change, what is the capacity of unions to assist in bringing this change that we desperately need to our classrooms, essentially? Earlier this year, I read through my union's submission to the Disability Inquiry, which was quite substantial and very alarming in the number of students the increase, should I say, in the number of students who have disability who are not having those needs met in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, I think that unions are really strong ways of pushing this. So, for example, in the NTEU, the National Tertiary Educators Union, we, in our own enterprise bargaining agreement at Sydney Uni, we developed in our centre with our collectively with our staff with disability some clauses to go into their enterprise bargaining round. So you can use their bargaining agreements to push certain things. But then I think the unions, we've had more difficulty motivating union members around sort of getting interested in disability if they're not on the page already. So that's another problem. I think is just you can push it with those hard sort of approaches via bargaining agreements, but actually motivating union members to be interested in something that they're not really interested in is more tricky, I think.
I guess my comment would be around, at times there's a polarisation of needs, you know, like that people are feeling like they can't accommodate students with disability, and we see this in the university as well, because they've not got the adequate resources and training and supports, and so there can be this polarisation where people with disability are put over in the too hard basket because it's compromising working conditions. So we have to bridge that gap around that conversation. We're not blaming teachers for being bad at their job. It's actually about resources, support, recognition, engaging with people with disability as teachers to be, you know, that expertise that Shane and Rodney were talking about, to bring that into the teaching community, and look at the way that can be adequately resourced, instead of it being, I can't cope with more children with disability in my or students with disability in my class. We have to change that conversation. So really important point though, and I think the unions and folk like us and some of the disability advocacy groups can be great allies, but those conversations haven't really been happening up to now. So thank you for that question. We've probably got time for one more question. Okay. I think I saw you having your hand up. Yeah. So you need to be signed. Oh, you first? Okay. And then go.
I have a similar question on the same vein of education. From a person who has seen the way that my ability has changed over the past year, and the way that people have treated me so dramatically different, in schools, how do you think ableism, not just from students but from teachers, and not just in a sort of bureaucratic way but in like a more personal way, how do you think that is affecting people with disability? Is it, and how do we fix it? Like, is it something that has to happen on a sort of like broad scale, or is it something that has to happen personally? Like, in communities and with people.
Do you want to take that attitude question, Shane?
So, I mean, this was a major theme of the Royal Commission. And so the Royal Commission did find that people in schools experience significant bullying and mistreatment, both from teachers. By the way, they experience good things as well, but and from other students. And people with disabilities say that the main reason for that is attitudinal. So negative attitudes to disability drive violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation. And that message was just overwhelming in all areas, including in schools. And attitudinal, the real challenge for us is that we know the problem, but we don't yet have the solutions to addressing attitudinal change. Attitudinal change is hard. We know some solutions. So immersion is part of it. I think there can be, so the encounter with people. So there is bullying, for example, in schools, but if you can start that encounter young, there's far less bullying, and you can teach people young so that they grow up with people with disability, and they're much less likely to bully in those places. So let's get inclusion as early as possible. There has been studies about attitudinal change programs in schools that have been really effective. So people with disability have run and they go around from school to school and talk about disability, and they're able to aim it at different levels for different ages of people. So I think there's various sort of levels of programs that we can do, and then we need an overarching, societal level disability attitudinal change programs. So I think this really is the sort of, we know this is a problem, and the next level or the next challenge for us as a society is working hard as to how do we change attitudes. And so, yeah.
Thank you. So we need to wind up. So I'm going to throw to Rodney first and go across the room. I imagine a world where people with disability are.
Thank you for spotlighting me for that question. Well, I think I have to go back to changing people's attitude. And my mind just goes back to the Indigenous communities of the past, where they just had signed languages there.
For everyone.
And it was just something that happened. And maybe the attitude was just one of acceptance. Maybe it was embracing disability. Maybe it was seeing people with disabilities as unique, or something other than deficit model that we seem to have now. And I think the goal that we have is to have the vision and the attitude of people with disabilities changing, and the potential to learn from people with disabilities as well. We can teach them, they can teach us. People as a whole, and I'm saying humanity as a whole, in some ways I think need to have people with disabilities as not strategically undervalued. So if we can find value in individuals, that will improve a lot of things, I'm sure.
Yeah. So you imagine a world where people with disability are valued and contributing in an inclusive way. Yeah, thank you. Jen?
I imagine a world where people with disability are, I think, valued for their own diversity too. Like, I think that sometimes we stereotype people with disability, and not just in a negative, not just that negative sort of stigma type stereotype, but we think people with disability are this, or people with disability are that, and that when we make policies or services, we actually have a stereotypical view of what those people with disability are. And it's often diagnosis based, rather than considering the person as an individual in the context of their lives and their communities and their families and their relationships. So it's about understanding the diversity within the disability community.
Thanks. Thanks, Jen. Shane?
It's a world where people with disability are not subject to disproportionate violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation, where they're seen and visible in all areas of society, where there's no shame that attaches to disability. We're not embarrassed to talk about disability, and where they lead and control and shape their own future and identity.
Thank you. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to our panel who, made a great contribution. If you want to get in touch with us, look up the Centre for Disability Research and Policy on the University of Sydney website. Google's the best though, the university website's a bit rubbish. So Google Centre for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney. We really encourage you to grow this conversation wherever you are, because disability is everybody's business. We know that, by having these conversations, we start to change attitudes. We've got a lot of work to do on that, but you can be part of that. So thank you very much. Appreciate your presence here today, and that's it from us.
Thank you very much, Kim, Rodney, Jen, and Shane from the centre. That one. I give you all a round of applause again. And just a word of information, this was streamed live on Woodford YouTube channel and will be available for viewing later on. You just need to Google Woodford Folk Festival on YouTube and it'll be there. I'm reliably informed. Thank you again and have a great new year.